Hi, I'm Daniel Lucas, and welcome to After Essay, where ideas take shape, thoughts find depth, and every conversation explores the art of thinking beyond the obvious. And today I have my special guest. She is the author of the book An Unlikely Prospect, no other than Miss Shelley Blanton-Stroud.
Mm.
Welcome, Miss Shelley. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I missed?
Yes, thank you for having me, Daniel. I am a writer of historical novels. I just published my fourth novel, An Unlikely Prospect. The previous three novels were historical mysteries, a trilogy that is called the Jane Benjamin novels, set in 1937, 39, and 42. This novel is set in 1945 San Francisco, and though many elements of the same world that were in the previous novels exist here, it has a different main character. It's a novel about what happened on VJ Day when Japan surrendered in World War II and celebrations broke out everywhere in the world, really, but also particularly in the United States, except in San Francisco. That was the only city whose celebration turned into a riot, leading to 1,000 hospitalizations, 13 deaths, and at least 6 rapes. In this book, I write about that scenario, including why the story was tamped down and almost no one knew about it. Before my life as a novelist, I spent 34 years teaching writing at the university. So and I've done a little bit else with writing instruction as well, but that's the main part of it.
Miss Shelley Blanton-Stroud, thank you so much for
Mhm.
sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. Hoping
Mhm.
for more and more empowering books like this to come.
Mhm.
Yes, and why did you choose World War II as a backdrop for this story?
Yeah. I don't know that I would have chosen World War II itself, except that some narrow, specific, concrete thing happened in my research that made me choose it, which was when I learned about the quote unquote peace riot, which is what this riot I described was called. I realized I'd never read about it before, which was very, very surprising to me because I study a lot of San Francisco history. And the more I started researching, the more I realized that when this happened in 1945, um, most of the people in power kind of tamped it down. They didn't want that story getting out about San Francisco. So it wasn't so much World War II that drew me in. It was the fact that there was a very little known historical event in a city that is almost always the setting for my novels that I'd never heard of, and I wanted to know more about it.
Was there a particular moment, story, or historical detail that sparked the idea for the novel?
Yeah, one of those would be that I was having a hard time finding all the information I needed to write this book. And one place where I really did was in the pages of the San Francisco Chronicle from 10 years ago. Right now, this month, it is the 80th anniversary of that peace riot. 10 years ago, on the 70th anniversary, the San Francisco Chronicle did some articles about it and, talked about the fact that it was essentially buried. And so that got me researching. But the moment that really defined things for me, letting me know I would really write this novel, was I knew that there was a grand jury convened immediately after the riot, and they finished up their work 2 weeks later. Um, and yet At the end of that time, the grand jury foreman, Chris Vogel, said really there was nothing anybody could have done about these 1,000 people hospitalized, 13 people killed, 6 women raped, and in fact, um, claimed that all of the authorities involved deserved commendation. Well, I was first of all, that really bothered me. How could he arrive at that conclusion when no one was held accountable for the violence? But also, I wanted to find out more about how the grand jury made their decision. So I went looking for the grand jury reports. And with the help of so many librarians, including the San Francisco History Center, the San Francisco Library, the clerk of the court in San Francisco, the UC Berkeley Library, and the State of California Law Library, um, we were able to find jury reports, grand jury reports from 1938, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 46, and 47, but not 1945. So the time period when I needed to be able to see what the district attorney, Pat Brown, had argued to the grand jury and what kind of information the grand jury was operating on, that was not available to me. And at first, it made me think, oh gosh, it's like I'm in a car that's gone into a ditch. There's nothing I can do with this or about this. And yet, um, after reflecting for a while, I realized that the absence of this evidence was a kind of invitation as a novelist to invent what I think might have happened. And so that opened up the whole process for me.
Miss Shelley, how do you begin shaping the characters who carry this story?
In particular, this protagonist, Sandy Zimmer, is someone who had been in my earlier novels, and I always kind of felt she might deserve her own starring role as protagonist. But I was very taken with a memoir I had read about Catherine Graham, who was the publisher of the Washington Post during the Pentagon Papers and Watergate time periods. And as I was reading that memoir, I realized that she had a personality that was very similar to my character, Sandy, already. And so when I was developing this character, I already knew Sandy a bit from the earlier books, but I didn't know how she personally would react when she was being tested by the events of this novel. And yet, because I was also reading the personal memoir of Catherine Graham, the other publisher, I realized I had support. I had a way of looking at how did another woman publisher at a time when there were scarcely any other publishers, how did she make her decisions in a whirlwind like that? And so the memoir helped me with Sandy's characterization.
What kind of research did you do to capture the reality of the World War II?
Well, in my case, it wasn't necessary to do much research on the actual war, World War II. It gets covered a little bit in my earlier novels, which dealt more directly with World War II. This is dealing with the after effects of World War II. So it comes on the day, literally, when Japan surrenders and World War II is over. The research, though, was very, very in depth and took quite a bit of time. I told you a little bit about doing the research to find the government documents related to the grand jury report, but also, there was a lot of that document research and reading memoirs and so on from people from that time. But also, there's a real world element of doing research for a novel like this. So, for a couple of weeks, I live in Sacramento, and I used to live in San Francisco for about 6 years. But for this novel, I went back and rented a house there for 2 weeks and really went on foot everywhere I could think of that would be relevant to this novel. I went around, I literally searched for my protagonist's apartment building, her penthouse, by touring San Francisco mansions. I found the root of the peace riot down in on Market Street in San Francisco, and I hired a driver who drove me along that route and stopped at every significant place so we could talk about what we saw there and what it might have been like, including because I had that driver. He did a much better job than I had done in finding the tiny little hospital that serviced all the injured people and the raped women from that event. I had not been able to find it myself, but because I had that driver with me, I was able to find it, see for myself what that location looked like, what it might have been like on that day. So there was really, for me, a mix of um, typical book research, newspaper articles, documents that the librarians were able to find for me, as well as in-person visits. Excuse me. Let me add to that, though, that another of the great disappointments to me from a writing point of view was that the 6 women who were raped, or that the hospital reports were raped, none of them went on the record. None of their names were saved. None of their stories were saved. So there was no oral history for me to use in order to tell the point of view of at least one of those women. So I had to go outside of the event itself, not relying on documents that told me about those particular women, but to go to documents that showed me what has been the reaction in the past of women who've suffered that kind of violence. And in particular, there was a book that dealt with, it's called The Trauma Beat, and it's about how people who've been victims of trauma, how do they react when the news reporters come knocking at their door so soon after the trauma to ask questions about it. And that actually, that source gave me a lot of information that wound up affecting the book.
Miss Shelley, how did you balance historical accuracy with creative storytelling?
Yeah, that's a really terrific question. One I think a lot about. For me, like I know that I have friends who write historical fiction. And if you picture a continuum, at one end is everything in the book is factually supported. At another end might be everything is fictionalized. I'm probably right about in the middle. And I have friends who are very far over to the left in that they tend to write historical fiction that is biographical historical fiction. So they don't include a character in the novel unless everything that they can say about that character can be validated from the historical record. In my case, I'm much more near the middle on that. I always base my novels on historical fact, things, incidents that took place, things that happened, processes that were being used, like that. And then I take that real life as inspiration for fictional characters. So, for instance, even though my main character in this novel, Sandy Zimmer, is inspired by a real life publisher, Catherine Graham, she's really an invention. She's a fictional character. Part of the reason for that, excuse me, is that I value the story itself. I value the arc of the story. I want it to be propulsive. I want the reader to not be able to put it down. And sometimes when I have tried to make my main character a real life character, I'm so conscious of needing to get it right accurately from the past that the story becomes baggy and loose and not as well crafted as I wanted to do it. I'm not saying that's what happens to other people. It's what happens when I write that way. And what I noticed is if I'm free to fictionalize key characters in my novels, then I'm also free to make sure the story moves the way it needs to move. So that's where I land on that continuum.
Were there any surprising discoveries during your research that changed the direction of the story?
Well, I sort of alluded already to the notion that I was inspired a bit by the um by oh, I just changed my mind when I was thinking something else came up for me. That was that when I had a driving tour of San Francisco that turned up a lot of interesting locations relevant to the novel, the thing that surprised me that really added to the story was that driver paused in front of a spot which was the UN Plaza. And he said, well, the UN conference, the conference that established the United Nations, was held right here, maybe 3 months before the incidents in your novel. And so people from all over the world came to San Francisco and stayed there for a good time, including the President of the United States, to establish the United Nations. And they were very close to being the final location for the United Nations headquarters. And he said there were a lot of people in town who really wanted to push to make San Francisco the home of the United Nations. And I had not been thinking of that in terms of my novel, about how close it was, a couple months apart from the events in my novel. And so that sort of accidental confrontation with fact led to a major change in the novel because I wanted to consider that the drive to win San Francisco the United Nations might have been part of the reason why authority figures and newspapers did not want to share the details of the riots because they wanted to improve their chances of winning the United Nations.
Let's talk about the writing process, Miss Shelley.
Mhm.
What was your daily or weekly writing routine like while working at this novel?
Yeah. I think it would be inaccurate. I think it would be a lie, actually, for me to act like every day is the same. I have a similar process all the time. But what I will say is there are chunks of time that always repeat through my books. There's like the gathering information period of like doing my research, going to the place, exploring. I think of that as the time period when I'm making a stew and I've thrown the carrots and the onions and the potatoes in the pot and they're starting to soften and to give an aroma so that I can recognize the flavor profile of this work. There's that period. Then there's the period where I start to make plans, where I think, how will I structure this? And then I'm not a pantser. I'm not someone who just writes intuitively. I have to have a plan in order to write, even though that plan will often change radically in the course of writing it. But I need to start with a plan to feel confident enough to write. And then once I've laid out my plan, then it's usually a time period that I consider pretty intensive writing. And that might be about 4 months where I've done all this thinking and research and talking to people. I've made out my plan for the whole novel. I've described every character gets a full character description. So I feel very confident of who they are and how they're motivated and the things they're afraid of, the things they want, the things they'll do anything to get. All of that's laid down in paper before I start writing. But when I start writing, it's more like it feels like an emergency to me. I'm writing long days, back to back every day until I get it done. And it hasn't been that in the months before. The months before have been looser and lighter, and you couldn't look at me and know so much how much of the heavy lifting of the writing of a book was going on behind that seemingly calmer backdrop.
Did you face any writer's block during the process and how did you overcome it?
You know, writer's block doesn't come to me in the process. And partly that's because there's so much pre work built into my process. So I've spent a lot of time figuring out the historical incidents I want to center on. And I've spent a lot of time figuring out who my characters are in advance. And I spent a lot of time doing the planning. Sometimes while I'm writing, I I don't think it's really fair to call it writer's block, but I feel like what I'm writing is kind of stale, like I'm just filling in my plan and I don't feel especially inspired by what I'm writing. But the funny thing is, if I write it all down and then I return to it a few weeks later, I can almost never tell the difference between what I wrote when I was feeling inspired and what I wrote when I was feeling rather flat. So I think for me, it helps me to know that's just a feeling at the moment of writing. It's not the fact of my writing. As long as I'm writing it down, as long as I'm moving forward, then it's good. And I think that believing that about my process gives me permission to write fluidly and not to feel that experience of writer's block.
Miss Shelley, how long did it take you from the first draft to the final manuscript?
Oh my goodness, I don't think I remember the dates of the first draft. I wish I had it in front of me. But I can say it was a year. It was about a year process that included some of the research and the planning and then the drafting. But there were three drafts. And I was working pretty intensely near the end of the process because I would go through a draft, then return right again to the start and redo that draft, and then realize I had a problem, and I would go back and redo it for that problem. Get to the end and realize, oh, I've got this other problem, and I go back and redo it again. So I guess maybe the strictly speaking writing portion of it was about 4 months, when the planning of it was more like a year.
Did you outline the book in detail beforehand or let the story unfold as you wrote?
I definitely, as I mentioned before, I do plan. I'm a plotter. I do outline it in detail. It's important to me, especially because I came up through writing historical mysteries. It's very important to me that the story moves, that it's propulsive, that it's not stalled or slow in the experience of the reader. And so I wanted to take care, and I always want to take care with the plot itself to make sure it moves. And so, what I usually do is I have a pretty bare bones um, plan for my plot for every scene. And the most basic thing I can tell you about it is that in every scene, something has to change. um, it can be for the better or for the worse. It could be something changing about the character. It could be something changing about a side character. It could be something changing about the investigation itself. But in order for my reader to get that feeling that this is propulsive and they don't want to put it down, I always have to make sure that where we start in a scene is not exactly where we end up. And so I do that planning. And a lot of times I'll say, in this scene, this is the thing that will change for whom, who's it going to change, and what provokes it, and what happens at the end of the scene as a result. I have those questions in my mind, and sometimes what I come up with just doesn't work. It's not interesting enough or doesn't make sense or something. So I'll keep toying with it. So the plan was good to have something change, but maybe my detailed response to what that plan would be sometimes doesn't work.
Miss Shelley, what themes were most important for you to explore in this story?
There were a couple that were especially important to me. One was because my main character is a publisher of a newspaper. Um, Very often, in a novel featuring someone in the news industry, the core value is truth, reporting the truth, the facts. And indeed, that was true of my main character, Sandy. She wants her newspaper not to avoid reporting the truth, even if it's upsetting and might ruin some things for her city. But I wanted to complicate that thematically and to say that that yes, she's the publisher of a newspaper, and so as a result, she values the truth at almost all costs. But also, she's not a reporter, she's the publisher. And so she has to confront realities of the business world around her. She employs so many people at that newspaper. She wants to be able to keep paying their checks. She doesn't want to throw them overboard into unemployment if she runs her newspaper into the ground. So, unlike maybe what a reporter might feel, Sandy, because she's the publisher, also has to take into account practical realities. And that's a big theme in the book. When you compare your ideal themes as a person, as a character, against your practical realities, where do you land? And that's a question that I work on throughout this novel.
How did you ensure the emotional truth of your characters match the intensity of the historical moment?
That was one, in one way, I felt very confident of it because I'd gone through the newspaper articles that were published 10 years ago that described scenes in the riot. So the middle part of the book, which really concerns itself with the riot, I felt very confident about the quote unquote truth because I had news articles to go on, and my job was to put my fictional character, my main character, Sandy Zimmer, I was to put her on those streets, experiencing the things that I knew did happen, and I needed to tell the truth about how a person like her might react to such scenes. I felt really pretty confident of that. The part I did not feel confident about and worried about a lot and ultimately felt good about was because I could not reach or get a hold of any oral histories of women who had been rape victims in this incident. And I couldn't find them from that historical time, which I know handled the crime of rape very differently. So that really worried me. So, about the truth, it helped me when I found that resource I told you about earlier, the trauma beat, and it helped me refocus just a little bit so that I was looking at when Sandy and her reporters come knocking at the door of the rape victim in the hospital, what would be their reaction to that conversation? And because I had that source material, I was able to feel very confident I was getting at the truth of how such a person might feel and react in that moment. That was very helpful.
Miss Shelley, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please to listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast because my abstract essay is already in fifth season, abstract poetry in second season, and my book 101 review in fifth season too, comedy 101 in second season, and my food 101 in fifth season as well, geography 101 in fourth season, and my baby podcast law 101 and mental health 101 love letters in third season, and movie 101 review and music 101 in fourth season, and science 101 and sex 101 in its first season. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcasts. So, Miss Shelley, what did writing an unlikely prospect teach you about yourself as an author?
Yeah, I think I learned a lot in the process of writing this novel. I recently gave a talk at the Sacramento History Museum about the 5 lessons I learned about writing historical fiction in the process of writing this novel. And one of those ideas is that it's very helpful to a reader and a writer in today's world where things are very complicated and oftentimes distressing and frightening, and where readers will spend a lot of time scrolling on their phone looking at news items of the day and feeling depressed and overwhelmed and unsure how to think about such matters. What I learned from writing this book is that writing historical fiction and reading historical fiction give the reader the opportunity to consider the big issues of their day that are especially troubling them, but at some remove, because we're looking at issues, like, for instance, with journalism in this novel that are troubling many readers today. And it may be a little too depressing to look at them only in terms of our contemporary lives. History lets us do it less painfully.
Definitely. And Miss Shelley, what advice would you give other writers tackling historical fiction?
Look for the cracks in the record, and that's where you can go play.
Definitely. Miss Shelley Blanton-Stroud, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
I would love for you to learn more about my books and perhaps attend a book event by visiting ShelleyBlantonStroud.com. Thank you.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Shelley Blanton-Stroud, because if you support her, for sure, more and more empowering books like this to come. So, Miss Shelley, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Lovely to speak with you.
More to come, people. See you soon.